The Crown Imperial was commissioned by Henry VII to celebrate the arrival of the new Tudor dynasty. But by the last years of his reign, Henry had debased both crown and monarchy with his avarice and, many thought, his tyranny. On the 24th of June, 1509, Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, was crowned in front of the high altar of Westminster Abbey. His personality, sunny and romantic, was the opposite of his father's, and it promised a fresh start. Though no one could have guessed how radical, even revolutionary, it would prove to be. Above all, he was no miser. Shortly after his accession, a contemporary wrote, "Our new king doesn't want gold and silver like his miserly old father. Instead, he aims and thirsts for nobler goals, virtue, glory, immortality." He was right, and Henry's reign turned into a quest for fame as obsessive as any modern celebrity's. It took many different forms, and it led Henry into territory where no English king had dared venture before. And, above all, it threatened to upset the traditional balance between freedom and authority, and to turn English kingship into an untrammeled despotism that claimed power over men's souls as well as their bodies. At the time of Henry's birth in 1491, the Tudors were a new, not very secure dynasty. His father had failed to reconcile the defeated Yorkist nobility, was about to embark on an unsuccessful war in France, and would steadily reduce the role of the crown to that of the greedy landlord. This dubious inheritance, however, was not destined for Henry, but for his elder brother Arthur, Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. Henry, as the second son, wasn't expected to be king, and as a result, he received a rather modern, unkingly kind of upbringing. Instead of having the rigorous demands of kingship knocked into him by male tutors and role models, he was brought up here at Eltham Palace by his mother and with his sisters, who idolized him. And this early experience of women's love made Henry a romantic and paved the way to the great passions and crimes of his adult life. Henry's mother also made sure that his education was of the best, and a succession of distinguished tutors gave him a thorough grounding in the latest Latin scholarship. Even the super-learned Erasmus was impressed, and when he met Henry, aged only 8, in this very great hall, he was bowled over by the boy's confidence, precocious learning, and star quality. But when he was only 11, Henry's life was struck by family tragedy. His brother Arthur died suddenly of a fever, followed soon after by his beloved mother. Henry was now the sole heir to the Tudor dynasty. For the boy, his new status was a double-edged sword. He might be the Prince of Wales, but the carefree life that he'd known was gone forever. There wasn't much love lost either between Prince Henry and his father, King Henry VII. Henry was growing up fast, and he was already taller and broader than his father. But the king, aware that the whole future of the Tudor dynasty depended on the life of his only surviving son, was fiercely protective. The conflict came over participation in extreme sports. Henry wanted to take part in the manly, aristocratic sport of jousting. But because it was so dangerous, his father allowed him to ride only in unarmed training exercises. When, in contrast, the real thing took place, Henry had to sit it out, chafing on the sidelines, whilst his friends slugged it out like men. The result was a clash, not only of arms, but of values between father and son about what it meant to be a king. On the 21st of April, 1509, Henry VII died, and the 17-year-old Henry was proclaimed king amidst wild scenes of popular rejoicing. The most impressive tribute came from Thomas More, the great scholar and lawyer whose life and death were to be inextricably linked with Henry's. This day, More wrote, is the end of our slavery, the fount of liberty, the end of sadness, the beginning of joy. Fired with the idealism of youth, Henry had strong ideas about kingship. He'd been brought up on the myths of King Arthur and the exploits of his ancestor Henry V. Like them, he believed in the traditional idea that a great king should be a great warlord. His court took on the feel of a magnificently armed camp with an endless round of tournaments and jousts. This is the Round Table of King Arthur at Winchester, then believed to have been Arthur's capital. Henry had first seen the table as an impressionable 14-year-old, and now that he was king, he seems to have decided to take Arthur as his model of kingship. Like Arthur, he would be a great jouster. He would have a brilliant court, and above all, he would follow in the footsteps of the once and future king and conquer France. To this end, one of Henry's first acts as king was to marry his brother's widow, the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, who was 6 years his senior. The marriage would sow the seeds of upheaval and revolutionary change in the English monarchy. At the time, however, it was much simpler. Henry loved Catherine, but the marriage was also cementing England's alliance with Spain against France. Henry was rearming England, and in 1511 he got the Council's agreement for war. On the 28th of June 1513, the English army crossed the Channel to France. For the first time in almost a century, Parliament had proved willing to vote serious war taxation. The result was the largest and best organised English army since Agincourt. Henry, like his great hero, Henry V, led the English army in person. He even came under fire, occasionally. He defeated the French in the Battle of the Spurs, so called because the French knights ran away so quickly, captured important prisoners, and took 2 French cities after set-piece sieges. Henry hadn't conquered all of France, of course, but otherwise he'd done everything that he'd set out to do. He'd restored the reputation of English arms. He'd made England once more one of the big 3 European powers, alongside France and the Habsburg Empire. And above all, he'd covered himself in glory. At the same time, however, Henry, or rather Catherine, since it was always the woman who was blamed, had failed to produce an heir. She gave birth to a short-lived son in 1511, but then followed miscarriage after miscarriage. Henry was surprisingly understanding, but how long could he wait for a son? Henry had triumphed in France and had covered himself in glory, but he hadn't done it alone. The architect of his victories was Thomas Wolsey. A butcher's son from Ipswich, Wolsey had risen from nothing through his intelligence, drive and ambition. Though nominally only a royal chaplain, it was he who'd organised the whole French campaign. His rewards were to be commensurate. In quick succession, he became bishop, archbishop and cardinal. As papal legate, he was the Pope's personal representative in England. And as Lord Chancellor, he was the King's indispensable friend and counsellor. Wolsey was now supreme in church and state. But as much as his power, contemporaries were impressed by his overweening, flamboyant character, by his taste, his magnificence, and his sense of display, whose supreme monument is his great palace here at Hampton Court. But we should not let this outward display deceive us about the reality of Wolsey's power. Wolsey had risen only because he was able to deliver what Henry yearned for, glory in war. And he would survive only if he were able to continue to deliver what Henry wanted, whatever it might be. But Wolsey and Henry had a problem. The gains of the French war proved fleeting, and by 1519, Henry was no longer the teenage star of Europe. There was a new, young, warlike king of France, Francis I, and a new, even younger Habsburg Emperor, Charles V, Queen Catherine's nephew, who ruled in his own right Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, and most of Italy. Both commanded much larger resources than Henry, which meant that glory in war was no longer a realistic option. But for the moment, England seemed to hold the balance of power between Francis and Charles and was courted by both sides. Wolsey, dexterous and inventive as usual, turned the situation to England's advantage by organising the Field of Cloth of Gold, which took place in a dusty, windswept plain in the northeast of France. It centred on a personal meeting between Henry VIII and Francis I, and in another first for Wolsey, it was one of the earliest modern summit conferences. But the Jamboree was much more than that. It was also an Olympic Games with an international jousting competition and an Expo cum Euro Disney with competitive displays of lavish cloth of gold tents and fantastic pavilions, which the English were generally reckoned to have won. It was also fantastically expensive, of course, but still it was cheaper than war, and it reinforced the image of Henry and Wolsey as the arbiters of Europe. But the image, like the Field of Cloth of Gold itself, proved to be a mirage. England's role as arbiter of Europe depended on the continuing balance of power. But sooner or later, Francis and Charles would fight, and one of them would win. What would Wolsey and Henry do then? The moment came in 1525 when Charles V's forces crushed the French armies and captured Francis I himself. But instead of trying to maintain the balance of power, Henry reverted to his early warlike dreams of conquest and proposed a partition of France with Charles. Charles called Henry's bluff. If Henry wanted his share of France, he must conquer it for himself. That required money. Parliament wouldn't have voted for taxation. Instead, Wolsey suggested an extra parliamentary levy, to which, as spin doctor in chief, he gave the emollient name of amicable grant. It made no difference. All taxes are unpopular. This one caused riots. And the worst one of all took place here in Lavenham in Suffolk, which was then a prosperous wool-weaving town. On the 4th of May, 4,000 protesters poured through the streets. The church bells rang the alarm, and the rioters swore that they would die in their quarrel. Other smaller protests took place throughout the southeast. In Lavenham, the rioters pleaded poverty, but in London, sophisticated constitutional objections were raised to a tax which hadn't been voted in Parliament. In the face of the protests, the government abandoned the amicable grant, and with it, Henry's projected invasion of France. Both Wolsey and Henry put a brave face on the climb down, but it was a terrible humiliation. Henry had failed in both peace and war, and his dreams of glory were dashed. But there was a ray of sunshine. Henry had fallen in love again. He'd also begun seriously to fall out of love with his wife, Catherine of Aragon. He'd had mistresses, even an acknowledged son by one of them. The real problem instead came from Catherine's own situation. The age difference between Henry and Catherine is now really beginning to tell, as this pair of miniatures also shows. Henry himself here, then aged 34, has kept his youthful looks, but Catherine, already 40, is wearing badly. As the massive neck and shoulders in the portrait shows, her once trim figure is fat, whilst her face, which had used to be so pretty, is now round and blotched and bloated. The explanation, of course, was childbearing. Catherine had been more or less continuously pregnant for the first 10 years of her marriage, and it had played havoc with her figure. If they'd been sons, none of this would have mattered. But of all those pregnancies, only a single child had survived, a daughter, Mary. And a woman who'd lost her looks, was past childbearing age, and hadn't produced an heir, was vulnerable indeed. Henry and Catherine's marriage wasn't the first royal union to get into difficulties. The man whose responsibility it was to sort out such problems was the Pope in Rome, head of the Catholic Church to which England, like all the rest of Western Europe, belonged. But at just this moment, the Pope's position was under greater threat than ever before. The attack was led by a young German academic, Martin Luther, who, in 1517, launched a furious assault on the corruption of the Roman Church, which began the Protestant Reformation. Henry and his minister, Cardinal Wolsey, were united in their horror at Luther's heretical attack on the church. In May 1521, Wolsey condemned Luther's works in a great book burning at St. Paul's Cathedral, whilst Henry wrote a reply to Luther called the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, or Defence of the Seven Sacraments. It's the first book to be written by an English king since Alfred the Great, and it's written in Latin and set in the latest Roman type for circulation to a sophisticated, select European audience. But above all, Henry's book was loud in its defence of the papal monarchy over the church. So much so that Thomas More, then Henry's friend and intimate counsellor, warned the king that, since his present good relations with Rome might change in the course of time, he should leave that point out, or else touch it more slenderly. But Henry was adamant in his championship of Rome, and his reward was the title of Defender of the Faith from a grateful Pope. Henry never wavered in his detestation of Luther and all his works, but his attitude to Rome, just as Thomas More predicted, underwent a revolution. The reasons were Henry's need for a son and heir, and love. And the woman he'd fallen in love with was Anne Boleyn, sister of one of his former mistresses. Sexy rather than beautiful, Anne behaved as no mistress had dared to before, with consequences that no one could have imagined. By the mid-1520s, Henry's reign had hit the buffers. He'd failed in his quest for glory in both peace and war. He'd failed to father a son and heir. He'd even failed to persuade Anne to sleep with him. For Anne, supremely confident in her hold over Henry, refused him sexual relations unless he agreed to marry her. The difficulty, of course, was that Henry was already married to Catherine, who would never agree to a divorce. So Henry and Anne tried to find legal grounds for dissolving Henry's marriage. Their best hope lay in the Bible, where the book of Leviticus forbade a man to marry his dead brother's widow on pain of childlessness. It was for this reason that Henry had received a special dispensation from Rome to permit him to marry Catherine. But now Henry's lawyers argued that, since the marriage broke biblical law, Rome had exceeded its powers and the marriage was invalid. The case was submitted for decision to the man who was both the Pope's personal representative in England and Henry's own chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey. Here, in the subterranean bowels of the Ministry of Defence building in Whitehall in London, amidst the ducting, the central heating pipes, and the spooks, there is an extraordinary survival of the Tudor world. And here it is. It's the wine cellar of the town palace of Cardinal Wolsey, known as York Place, that once stood on this site. And actually, above where I'm standing here, on the first floor, there was the principal reception room of the palace, known as the Great Chamber. It was almost certainly in this Great Chamber, on the 17th of May, 1527, that there opened the first trial of the marriage of Henry VIII. It's known as the secret trial, since Catherine was kept in the dark, and Henry was confident that Wolsey would rule his marriage invalid. Instead, to enormous surprise, on the 31st of May, Wolsey adjourned the court indefinitely on grounds of the difficulty of the case. Why did Wolsey, who owed everything to Henry, defy the king's wishes? Was it because of the reluctance of his fellow judge? Did Wolsey fear Anne Boleyn's power as queen? Were his legal doubts genuine? Or was it, above all, because he felt that in a matter of such moment, the Pope himself must be involved? Whatever his reasons, the delay was crucial. For, at exactly the same moment, events were unfolding in Rome, which would make it impossible for the Pope, even if he'd wished, to come down on Henry's side. 2 days after Wolsey adjourned the court, news reached England that the troops of the Emperor Charles V had taken Rome, sacked and pillaged the city, and driven the Pope to take refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo here. The Pope was now in the power of Catherine's nephew, and he would remain so for the foreseeable future. This meant that Henry's hopes of a quickie divorce were at an end. Henry and Anne had thought to be married in months. Instead, the months stretched into years as the Pope strung out Henry with legal manoeuvres and diplomatic subtleties. But with the failure of the second divorce trial in 1529, Henry's patience was at an end. So, just as importantly, was Anne's. Wolsey knew his power and his life were at stake. Desperate to find his way back into Henry's favour, he wrote the king a long letter setting out the case for his own approach to the divorce. He sat down at his desk at 4 a.m, never, his valet noted, rising once to piss, nor yet to eat any meat, but continually wrote his letters with his own hand. But not even Wolsey could change the reality of European power politics.
Faced with the brute fact of Charles V's power, Wolsey, for all his cleverness and confidence, was unable to persuade the Pope to disavow his predecessor's dispensation. This failure cost him his job as the king's minister, and it would have cost him his head if he'd lived longer. Wolsey died cursing Anne for causing his downfall and predicting the ruin of the Church of England.
So, blocked in Rome, Anne Boleyn, who was a Lutheran sympathiser, encouraged Henry to turn to Rome's English opponents, who were concentrated in Cambridge.
It's not what you know, but who you know, we're told. In the case of Thomas Cranmer, it was both. When the divorce crisis began, Cranmer was an obscure theology don at Cambridge, where, along with his colleagues in the faculty, he probably preached from this very pulpit here in St. Edward's Church. But in the summer of 1529, a chance meeting with 2 Cambridge acquaintances brought Cranmer to the notice of Henry and Anne. The consequences transformed Cranmer, his world and ours. For Henry, Cranmer said, had been going about the divorce in the wrong way. He'd been treating it as a legal matter, but it wasn't. It was moral. And in morals, the Bible supplied absolute answers of what was right and what was wrong. And there were experts who knew which was which. They were university theologians, like Cranmer himself. Only, therefore, let Henry consult the universities, and he would have a clear, unambiguous verdict in favour of the divorce, which even Rome and the Pope would have to recognise.
The argument was music to Henry's ears, and the canvass of university opinion began, starting in Cambridge itself.
This courtyard was the centre of the medieval University of Cambridge. Up there, on the first floor, is the room where the Regent House, then the governing body of the university, debated its verdict on Henry's divorce. Cranmer had thought that it would be high-minded and straightforward. In fact, both sides played dirty and used every device of the academic politician, rigged committees, selective terms of reference, and straightforward bullying and bribing. But after 2 days of toing and froing, the university delivered the verdict that Henry wanted. Cambridge would be on the side of the winners in Tudor England.
And now Henry's envoys set out for the continent to pit the arguments of the King of England against the authority of the Pope. In universities across Europe, they bribed, cajoled, and threatened theologians to give a verdict in Henry's favour.
Over the next few years, the whole power of the Tudor state was to be thrown against Rome and Catherine. But Catherine wasn't without her defenders. One of the boldest was her chaplain, Thomas Abel, who combined the very different roles of scholar and man of action. In the winter of 1528, Henry sent Abel on a mission to Catherine's nephew, the Emperor Charles V, in Spain, where Abel played the desperately dangerous game of double agent. Outwardly, he was working for Henry. Secretly, he was undermining the king's whole strategy on Catherine's behalf. Mission accomplished, Abel returned to England, where he quickly emerged as Catherine's most effective and outspoken scholarly propagandist, as this book shows. Abel called it, with magnificent defiance, Invicta Veritas, truth unconquered and unconquerable. In it, he attacked the verdict of the universities, which provided the whole intellectual basis of Henry's case. And the attack went home, as the king's infuriated scribbles throughout the book show. Here, Henry's irritation actually overcomes his scholarship, and he scribbles in the margin in mere English, "It is false." But by the time he'd finished, Henry's composure had recovered sufficiently for him to deliver his damning verdict on the book in portentous Latin, here on the title page. The whole basis of this book is false. Therefore, the papal authority is empty, save in its own seat. Not even that magisterial royal rebuke was enough to shut Abel up. Instead, it took the full weight of the law. He was twice imprisoned in the Tower, where he carved his name and bell symbol on the wall of his cell, and eventually executed as a traitor in 1540.
But even Abel's courage proved fruitless. As learned opinions swung in his direction, Henry became bolder. He now asserted that, by virtue of his God-given office, the King of England was an emperor. As such, he was subject to no authority on earth, especially to that of the Pope. Once Henry had been the stoutest defender of papal authority, but that had changed with the problem of his divorce. Now, the achievement of his most fervent hopes for Anne and for an heir depended on the idea that religious truth was to be found, not in Rome, but in the Bible. Rome instead was the obstacle that had delayed his divorce for 5 long years. It was the enemy that stood between him and Anne. But what of the Pope? Here again, the Bible spoke. For there were no popes in Scripture, but there were kings. And it was kings, Cranmer and his radical colleagues argued, who were God's anointed, ordained by him to rule his church on earth. The idea appealed to Henry's thirst for glory. It offered a means to cut the Gordian knot of the divorce. And it even promised to make Henry, not the Pope, heir to the power and status of the ancient Roman emperors. It was intoxicating. Henry now stood on the threshold of a decision that would transform the monarchy and England utterly and forever. On the 19th of January, 1531, Convocation, the Parliament of the English Church, met here in the chapter house at Westminster Abbey. They faced an unprecedented demand to acknowledge that the king was only protector and supreme head of the English Church. Over the next 2 weeks, they fought that demand word by word and letter by letter. Finally, the Archbishop of Canterbury proposed that Henry should indeed be accepted as supreme head in earth of the Church of England, as far as the law of Christ allows. His announcement was greeted with a stunned silence, which the Archbishop ingeniously took to mean consent. The weasel words, "as far as the law of Christ allows," meant what anybody wanted them to mean, and the next year they were dropped. Henry was now supreme head without qualification. He'd also, by his actions, broken Magna Carta and the first clause of his own coronation oath, by which he'd sworn that the Church in England should be free. And he'd become a bigamist as well. In October 1532, Anne finally gave in and slept with Henry. By Christmas, she was pregnant, and in January 1533, in strictest secrecy, Henry married Anne, despite the fact that Catherine was still legally his wife. The
The next month, Cranmer was made Archbishop of Canterbury with the mission to implement Henry's royal supremacy over the Church of England. Cranmer's first and most momentous step came a few weeks later, when he declared Henry's marriage to Catherine unlawful and Anne instead to be his true wife. After 7 years, Henry had the woman and the queen he wanted. The London crowds grumbled. Charles V was furious, and the Pope excommunicated the king. But Henry and Anne defied them all.
Henry's second marriage and the royal supremacy, which was its intellectual foundation, were profoundly divisive. Some opposed them viscerally because they hated Anne or loved the old church. Others were more nuanced, and subtlest of all, as befits the man who'd warned Henry about exaggerating the Pope's powers when the king wrote the Assertio, was Henry's old friend and counsellor, Sir Thomas More. But opponents of whatever sort were whipped into line by laws which required them to swear a double oath, to accept the king's second marriage and to reject the papal supremacy. To refuse the oath was treason and death. More refused the oath, and he was imprisoned in steadily worsening conditions in this cell in the Tower for over a year. But when, on the 1st of July 1535, he was removed from here for his trial at Westminster Hall, it looked as though he might escape. More now did what hitherto he'd steadfastly refused to do, and spoke his mind. He could not be guilty, he said, because the English Parliament could not make Henry VIII supreme head of the Church. For the common consent of Christendom, of which England was only a tiny part, gave that title to the Pope and had done for over 1,000 years. Consternation in court. But the Lord Chief Justice recovered the situation with a characteristic piece of English legal positivism. English law was what the English Parliament said it was, he asserted. More was condemned and beheaded on the 6th of July.
Working with Parliament rather than against it, Henry had hugely outdone his father. He'd invested the so-called imperial crown with a truly imperial authority over church and state. He'd even get his hands on more land and money than the miserly Henry VII could have dreamt of, and he got it by plundering the wealth of the church. There were about 500 monasteries scattered over England. Some were desperately poor, but many were rich and well run and maintained a 1,000-year-old tradition of prayer, work and learning. But a change of intellectual fashion away from monasticism made them vulnerable, and their collective wealth made them tempting. So, in 1536, the process of dissolving the monasteries began. At first, the objective was presented as reform, but it soon turned to outright abolition, and by 1540, the last abbey had gone. The monks were pensioned off, and their land, buildings and treasures confiscated. A few were retained as parish churches or cathedrals, but most were not. They were stripped of the lead on their roofs, the gold and jewels on their shrines, and left to rot. It was desecration and sacrilege on the grandest scale. It provoked shock, outrage, and finally open revolt. The result was that in the autumn of 1536, Henry faced the worst crisis of his reign, the rebellion known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. The first uprising was in Lincolnshire. It spread quickly across the north of England. Under their banner of the 5 wounds of Christ, noblemen and peasants joined together, demanding the restoration of the monasteries and the return of the old religion.
Some monks and priests played a leading part in the revolt, preaching incendiary sermons and even wearing armour. Adam Sedber, abbot of Jervaux Abbey here, wasn't one of them. Instead, when the rebel hordes turned up at the gates of his monastery, he fled to the surrounding moorland. But the threat to burn down his monastery forced him to return, however reluctantly, and join the revolt.
Secure in their control of the north, the formidably well-disciplined rebel army marched south. By the time they reached Doncaster, only the king's much smaller forces stood between them and London, and perhaps Henry's throne.
This area is known as Scoresby-Lees, and this unprepossessing tract in a field was once the line of the Great North Road, where it crosses the broad plain on the northern bank of the River Don. And it was all around here, at dawn, on the morning of the 26th of October, that the rebels called a general muster of their troops. All the flower of the north was there. Where the final count was taken, they numbered 30,000 men, with another 12,000 in reserve at Pontefract. It was the largest army that England had seen since the Wars of the Roses, and it wasn't the king's.
But even though the rebels faced only 8,000 of Henry's forces, they chose to negotiate. They persuaded themselves that the attack on the church was the work not of the king, but of his wicked advisers like Cranmer. They were also double-crossed by the king's representative. He promised them pardon and, believing him, the huge rebel army dispersed. But a few months later, a new minor revolt in the north gave Henry the excuse he'd wanted to break his promises and exact revenge. The leaders of the revolt were arrested and sent to London for trial. Henry was especially severe on clerics who'd been involved, even when, like Abbot Sedber of Jervaux, they'd been coerced into joining the revolt. Sedber was arrested with the rest and sent to the Tower.
Then he was tried, condemned, and saw Jervaux confiscated. The aristocratic leaders of the revolt were beheaded, but the rest, including Sedber himself, suffered the full horrors of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Henry's supreme headship of the church, which had begun in the name of freeing England from the papal yoke, was turning into a new royal tyranny to be enforced in blood.
And no one was exempt. In May 1536, after only 3 years of marriage, Anne was executed on trumped-up charges of adultery, incest, and sexual perversion. But her real crimes were less exotic. She'd failed to adjust from the dominant role of mistress to the submissive one of wife. And above all, like Catherine before her, she'd failed to give Henry a son. Within 24 hours of Anne's execution, Henry was betrothed again, and on the 30th of May, he married his third wife, Jane Seymour. Demure and submissive, conservative in religion, Jane was everything that Anne was not. And in October 1537, she did what Anne and Catherine had both failed to do, and gave birth to a healthy son and heir, Edward. Jane died a few days later, but the boy lived and became Henry's pride and joy.
All of the problems which had led to the break with Rome, the king's first 2 disputed marriages, his lack of a male heir, were now solved. With the occasions of the dispute out of the way, why didn't the naturally conservative Henry return to the bosom of the Roman Church? The answer lies in this painting here. The original, of which it's a copy, was sited in the king's private apartments and, as such, takes us into his very mind. The date,
1537, is the year of Prince Edward's birth. In the foreground is the proud father, Henry VIII, together with the recently deceased mother, Jane Seymour. Behind are Henry's own parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, while in the middle there are inscribed Latin verses which explain the meaning of the painting. Which is the greater, the verses ask, the father or the son? Henry VII was great, they reply, for he brought to an end the Wars of the Roses. But Henry VIII was greater, indeed the greatest, for whilst he was king, true religion was restored and the power of popes trodden underfoot. This, then, is why Henry refused to return to Rome. The supremacy may have begun as a mere convenient device to facilitate his marriage to Anne Boleyn, but it had quickly taken on a life of its own as Henry had persuaded himself that it was his birthright, his raison d'être, and above all, his passport to fame, not only vis-à-vis his father, but in the eyes of posterity as well.
Henry had got what he wanted, but to do so, he'd had to use ideas like Luther's biblically based approach to religion, which he detested. The symbol of these compromises was the New English translation of the Bible.
The title page shows how literally Henry took his new grand title of Supreme Head in Earth of the Church of England. At the top of the page, of course, there appears Christ as God the Son, but he's very small. Instead, the composition is dominated by the huge fleshly presence of Henry VIII. As king comes supreme head, he sits enthroned in the centre, with, on the left, the bishops, representing the clergy and the church, and on the right, the Privy Council, representing the laity and the state. Below, there are the people, who all join together in the grateful, obedient cry of Vivat, Vivat Rex, long live the king, God save the king. The title page of the Great Bible represents, in microcosm, the extraordinary achievement of Henry's reign. He'd broken the power of the Pope, dissolved the monasteries, defeated rebellion, beheaded traitors, and made himself supreme over church and state. All the powers and all the passions of a ferocious nationalism were contained in his person and at his command. But the royal supremacy also contained the seeds of its own destruction.
For, in employing the new biblically based theology, Henry had allowed into England those very subversive religious ideas he'd once tried so hard to suppress. The genie of Protestantism was out of the bottle, and it was Protestantism which, only 100 years later, would first challenge the powers of the monarchy and finally dethrone and behead a king of England.